Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you might walk into this. Both now, I'm experimenting with something I've never done before. Um, Both Twitter Spaces Live as well as my go to Truth Bomb on YouTube. My name is Patrick Lovell, and I am an investigative journalist and a muckraker. And I value truth and justice and the integrity of law and liberty and justice for all above all else. I hate to make a proclamation right off the top that sounds a little bit ideological, but the long and the short of it is that I experimented with these Twitter spaces a couple of days ago, and I found that it was pretty interesting, sort of, I don't know, um, shall we say, what are we all trying to do in this crazy day and age of media? I was penetrating. I actually was finding an audience. In these two particular Twitter spaces that I hosted, one with my colleague and my good friend Paris Dubé, and the other one with defense attorney who is now on suspension in Southern Florida, a gentleman by the name of Bruce Jacobs. And we're up to over like 7,000, 8,000 views on the frequency bar. And, that's a hell of a kind of an audience. And the other interesting thing about what I've experienced recently on Twitter, and I'm trying to do all of these corollaries to where I get a better feel for, how to maneuver and to, I don't know, juck and dive, I guess, in between all of the different social media sort of scenarios and platforms to get a better understanding of how to become more effective because I have incredible information that, if you follow some of my tweets, you know that from time to time, particularly last night, and I should timestamp this. This is, I guess we're Tuesday morning, July 19th, 2023 at approximately 10 a.m. my time. And yeah, last night, because of all of the news regarding the elector certification crackdown by DOJ and felony charges in Michigan and other things, and how that sort of fits in context to the federal and both state sort of convergence of, I would say, circling the noose around Donald Trump. And some of the findings are so extraordinarily parallel. And while they are, you know, overwhelming the mainstream media space, they are, which constitutes news and everything that, maybe drives the national dialogue. What we're finding, or what I'm finding, what I know, is that Donald Trump and all things Donald Trump, quite frankly, are both a reflection and a refraction of everything that I've been trying to get your attention. And I've been screaming from the mountaintops for a very long time. And I, you know, am doing everything I possibly can to carry this incredible freaking load on my shoulders until somehow it penetrates the millions of people that need to understand what exactly corruption is and also become aware of media deception, how it's destroying us, and ultimately what we can do about it. And I want to give you kind of a cultural reference to kind of start things off to set the table. Because of the nature of media, because we have, I don't know how many, incredible platforms at our fingertips to be able to get our voices out there, but it's an ocean of people getting their voices out there because everybody, has free speech and everybody has the tools to be able to say what they need to say, and some are better than it at it than others, and others have incredible resources. And incredible resources typically come, by way of in communication from the space that I've been in for 25 plus years. I'm a producer, and I'm a professional producer, and I've done a lot of work through the years. And I stumbled into becoming an investigative journalist. It was just kind of one of those things where I have always been aware of what's going on. I've always been somebody very, very interested in power and control and good and evil and how things work out. And I've always been passionate about justice. And I studied political science in college. I was an average student, but I did very well in political science. And I always kind of considered I'd wind up going to law school and follow in the footsteps of my dad, who was a corporate attorney and the epitomized professionalism. And I loved the legal profession, and I always kind of figured I'd get there. And plus, the idea of making money and looking like people that come from my generation, like back in the day, L.A. law, for example, was appealing to me. But what happened was after I graduated from college and throughout college, I've always had a taste for adventure, and I traveled all around the world, and I love to engage in action sports. And so I became, a skier and a snowboarder and water skier, taught water skiing at Club Med for a stint. And I love to surf. And, I just love to get out in the world and experience things and travel and meet people and understand different cultures and that sort of thing. And I did that for quite a while, both during college and after college. And when I finally kind of figured out what I wanted to do, the whole time my eye was on going to law school. But I decided I'd take a step into Hollywood and tip my toe in the water and see if I could actually do what it was that I had a passion for. And I loved movies. I was always inspired, above all else, by during my come up, guys like Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone was a huge influence in my life. So was Martin Scorsese, and then later Guy Ritchie, who's my age. But all of those filmmakers represent the types of films that I really, really enjoy and love, and probably above all else, Quentin Tarantino. And all of those sorts of storylines, and particularly in the '90s when I was in Hollywood, there was this growth of independent film. And during that time period, also, we had this incredible sort of new market for documentary film. And Michael Moore came out at that time. He grabbed his camera. He came out of Flint, Michigan. He goes and tells the story about offshoring and outsourcing and corporate monopolies and how it destroyed, his world in Roger and Me. And it found a foothold, and it was incredibly important, and some incredible things happened. All of those things combined created a groundswell to, basically push me in a direction where ultimately I became a producer. I started off in advertising. I worked for some huge advertising agencies, and then I ended up getting the opportunity to work for some huge executive producers. So through those scenarios and being in the sort of, the heartbeat of it all in Los Angeles, I got a front row seat to how things work. And I was living kind of a B-list, entourage lifestyle. I'd go to big parties with celebrities and that sort of thing in the Hollywood Hills and Beverly Hills and that sort of thing. And, and so I could like rub elbows with the important people, and I could speak the right language because I was working for the big executive producers, but I was really just a slave. I was a guy working 24/7 to try to keep my lips above water. And, as such, I got this kind of like crazy sort of real life experience in how the world is that is now what is for most people. So, for example, a lot of times you didn't get full-time jobs. You got temp, assignments, and you would have to live kind of hand to mouth, and you were still a slave, but you didn't get the perks of being a full-time employee and healthcare and all that sort of thing. And so you just had to struggle and force your way through because you wanted the access and you wanted to get the experience and you wanted to get into a place where you kind of felt like, okay, one day I'm going to be the next big thing. And, healthcare insurance and everything else is like secondary in your mind when you're in your 20s, right? And so, and I also came from a upper middle class family. I had made a lot of money when I was younger. So I wasn't dying. I had resources, and I wasn't, as much as I was struggling, I wasn't, struggling as much as a lot of people did. And, and I call that the righteous grind anyway. People just, doing everything that they can to try to get to where they want to be. And so that was kind of my mentality. And by the time I got to the late 90s, I ended up kind of falling out of Hollywood because I'd gotten to the point where it was just too much. And I wasn't getting to where I wanted to go. So I had to kind of, bail out because my parents offered me an opportunity. Again, I'm a real rough lifestyle, right? My parents had a condo in Park City, Utah, and they said, "Hey, man, do you want to, take a break and see if you can recharge and maybe, check out and ski for a season and maybe get a job in a town and kind of ski bum it and see what happens next?" And so I took him up on that, and that changed my life forever from where I was going because, ironically, I wound up getting a job working across the street from where I lived at a small television station that was in great proximity, and I got to live this great lifestyle. But I became a producer working at the small station as well as the director of sales. And because we didn't have, for example, um, the Nielsen ratings, I had to hustle and create all sorts of sort of win-win for companies that would wind up advertising on our station because it was outside of the boundaries of what was television at that time. We're talking about early 2000s at this point, and I'd come up with really innovative things. And the reason I tell you that is because ultimately the internet would take over, and everybody online would end up, now and over the course of the last many years, have to do innovative things to get big audiences, right? And so we're in the sea shift, and we have been for, 2 decades, where when I grew up with media and that sort of soil that fermented to inspire me to want to become a producer, and the films like Oliver Stone, and then of course, really a whole degree of writers at that time and even before and everything else, inspired me to think there was a market for truth, because in our society there always was a market for truth. But ultimately, what happened was that the biggest irony of all, that everybody's got to get money from somewhere. And whether that is finding a sponsor for your product or finding eyeballs that are going to follow you so that you can get it baked into the algorithms and all of those sorts of scenarios, that would impact how media would exist. And so mainstream evolved or devolved from a scenario where we had, thousands of newspapers around the country that were doing great investigative work. Particularly, the way it would work is that, great writers would do great stories, in their local communities, and, beat writers would move into larger markets, and then they'd get bigger stories and so on until they reach, the top markets, and then they became a national name. Okay, that was one pathway to becoming someone well known in the journalistic space. And then, of course, for those who remember, typically our media was kind of like the golden goose, and it was separate from all things advertising. And so, the idea was that even though there was a lot of flaws to it, the idea was that we had, platforms that had integrity. There was journalistic integrity, and there was professionals in the system, even though there was always a lot of question marks, and there's always a lot of creative people, and there's always a lot of clever people that rise to the top, sort of thing. But ultimately, this evolved into this sort of free for all, where the sort of powers that be in the media space, particularly in the late '90s, early '90s, I guess, really is when it started to evolve, discovered that the way you were going to get ratings, it was to give the people what they wanted to hear. And so you'd build your entire sort of echo chamber in your communication device and your platforms to be able to carve out a specific amount of viewers per night, and then you would justify that based on Nielsen and what you could get as a network per 30-second spot. And so that was the revenue model for what became CNN, MSNBC, and of course Fox. And they got more and more committed to that, to the point that, as we just saw recently with the Dominion lawsuit, with the Fox settlement, was the idea that Rupert Murdoch had admitted through a subpoena that the whole idea of Fox was to lie and to provide the information that its audience wanted to hear. And he paid $787 million to make the lawsuit go away because there's much more evidence of deception. And of course, that created all of this sort of, juggernaut, and then I guess the ejection of Tucker Carlson and who's Tucker Carlson and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, that all happened, and I guess that's the first time that we've ever seen recently, because, in media, all of the major corporate media have to do things within the sort of framework of their sort of corporate legal structure. you've got to be careful of libel. You got to be careful of this and that and everything else because you don't want to get your network sued. But what Murdoch proved, and then everybody else chased eventually, was that no, lying for your audience is actually the key to making incredible revenue. So much so that, for example, the revenue model structure of Fox, which is monumentally bigger than its competitors. I believe that Fox had $14.7 billion in revenue in 2022. Their operating budgets were somewhere in the 11 billion range. So you're pushing 4 billion in 2022 for lying. And of course, okay, Murdoch's worth I don't know how many billions, right? But he could have stroked the $787 million check himself, but of course put it on the shareholders and no harm, no foul. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Fox stock increased as a result of settling. Now Fox has got many other lawsuits waiting in the wings, so we'll see what happens next. But I'm just saying that this has proved the model. Now MSNBC, CNN, they're all variations of the same. The president of CNN, Jeff Zucker, and also the president of CBS, famously said back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. Well, they've said it many times, but particularly as we got into the 2014-15 election cycle, when Donald Trump put his hat in the ring, that Les Moonves said, and so did Jeff Zucker, by the way, that Trump was good for ratings, right? Well, who was Trump? Well, Trump, I guess, was a national celebrity going back to the 80s because he's, this New York real estate tycoon, ultimately winds up on this reality television show called The Apprentice. And, The Apprentice is on mainstream television at night, produced by the same guy that does, all of the Survivor shows and that sort of thing. And Greatest Race, and I can't remember his name, even though he's the biggest name in mainstream reality television. But, Donald Trump was always running for president anyway, I think going back to, late 90s sort of thing. But what was Donald Trump doing all the time in the meantime? And especially during the show The Apprentice? Well, as it turns out, Donald Trump was always a control fraud. Well, what is control fraud? Therein lies the ultimate revelation. So in real estate, particularly real estate, and this can happen throughout, any sort of corporate sort of structure, but especially when you're securitizing your product. But in real estate, there's a lot of tricks that can be played if you're a major developer, and as Trump has, proudly proclaimed time and time again that, hey, bankruptcy is okay. I used bankruptcy to become a billionaire. And I think Trump has been bankrupt 6 times. And but how can Trump be bankrupt and yet still a billionaire and still, swimming and get investment capital and that sort of thing? Doesn't add up, right? Because isn't bankruptcy a mark of failure? And it's a fantastic sort of, fallback for capitalism, because capitalism, the whole idea is risk reward. Investors invest into an idea, could be a fantastic product. Let's think about Steve Jobs and Apple, for whatever flaws that they have with offshoring and outsourcing and tax write-offs and that sort of thing. But long and the short of it is that innovation typically moves jobs forward, country forward, technology, see a need, fill a need. And in the notion of capitalism, the thing about bankruptcy that's so incredibly important is it does give the opportunity to entrepreneurs to take chances and do things that could potentially lead to monumental, changes, paradigm change, so to speak, right? Now, typically, if you understand the statistics in business, a lot of times the risk reward, and this is why most investors tend to want to diversify, but ultimately they, have a couple that hit big. Like let's think about the .com scenario. There was a huge run up in the late 90s and early 2000s until the technology space blew up. But as a result of that, we end up with some of the biggest tech firms that changed the world, right? Google, Apple, Microsoft, so on and so forth, right? There was 1,000 other companies that went bankrupt, but the bottom line was, we still had to push forward. And so a lot of these constructs and these scenarios are made possible because of legal structures, quite frankly, LLCs, and then of course the notion of bankruptcy, where investors who have money to invest and they want to grow their capital. Let's say you're a doctor, you're an attorney, you've got a basic income. You want your money to grow and work. And so ultimately, a lot of the times, one of the segments of growth capital, of course, are assets, particularly real estate and also stocks. But in this case, sticking with the analogy and the run through with why I'm actually doing this at the moment, was Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as a developer, of course, he was born on third base because his father, Fred Trump, was a developer, and everything that constitutes. I think Donald Trump inherited close to $1 billion in what? I don't remember when Fred Trump died, but I think it was in the 70s. But if you did the math, I think I've seen this all over online. I mean, Donald Trump would be worth billions multiple times over if he just let the money work for him and let basic asset managers manage his money. But he had a huge ego, and so Trump wanted to put his name on these huge towers, and in doing so, in the late 70s and 80s, Trump become this mainstream celebrity. But at the same time, he's working what he's got to work behind the scenes in Manhattan to get these buildings done. And of course, if you're doing business in the 70s at that time, you're dealing with the mob, you're dealing with the Teamsters, you're dealing with the five families. And at that time, I'm sure Donald Trump learned a lot on the job. Not to mention, of course, his attorney, Cohen, right, who represented J. Edgar Hoover, right? But, he was in this, this viper's den, as he had, he had learned that could be on the front page of the New York Times, on Newsweek, and then eventually all over the National Enquirer, which is extremely important. But, what he was doing to develop, these huge pieces of real estate in the center of Manhattan was, one, you get tax incentives, you get investors to invest, you build, you have to cut costs the best you can. If you're a developer, like a producer, you try to get the project done efficiently with the capital that you have, and then you sell it. And because of all of those, scenarios, there's a lot of revenue streams that come from it. And then the real estate's going to have value too. And of course, that's how you become a mega player and a potential billionaire. But what's interesting is that when you understand real estate and you understand value of real estate, you have to understand appraisal, and you have to understand how appraisals are created. And to get the appraisals professionally, there are professional codes. I think they're called UDAP codes that enable appraisers to get licensed. And then if they sell that real estate, and of course, if you're a vertical like Donald Trump, you have your internal machine selling your real estate, and there are methodologies to do that. And as we're all focused in at the moment on Donald Trump, potentially going to be indicted after what happened last night with the 16 felony counts against those that are conspiratorial with documentation fraud as it relates to electoral certification fraud and everything that we're learning from that. So, for example, if you lie on a document in any particular business situation, I think in this case, those that lied on those documents are facing 4 years potentially for forging their signatures, but it's perjury and forgery are against the law, okay? And when you do so, as we're seeing pan out, and that's the sort of the mainstream sort of echo chamber, and everybody's going nuts because you added up on top of course, the Jack Smith investigation into Mar-a-Lago and the top secret documents, and those 37 indictments, and of course the 37 plus 38 indictments up in the Southern District of Manhattan through Alvin Bragg because of can't think of her name at the moment because she hasn't been in the cycle. The former porn star that lied for Trump and everything that constitutes with his former attorney and all that kind of stuff. And there's more to come. But everything that I'm explaining to you also is in 200 particular cases that are actually working itself through the system in the AG's office of Manhattan. And that's Letitia James. And a lot of these, which go back decades, these cases, are revelations of what we call control fraud. And so what we show you in our work, my work, the Con that is now available at thecon.tv, there's a methodology to creating what we call representations and warranties. And representations and warranties are what the offering company has to maintain that follow the legal structure to be able to sell securities. Now, in the case of Donald Trump and all of this mishigas as it relates to his business model and what control fraud actually is, you might recall that with Donald Trump, about 4 months ago, I think it was, maybe 6 months ago now. I mean, the cycle's insane when it comes to Donald Trump. But Donald Trump, it was revealed that Donald Trump, had been hyperinflating the assets of his New York penthouse apartment to where, the most easy to discover lies. For example, how many square feet is his penthouse apartment? Well, he doubled the size of it. He doubled the size of it. And then he also, I think, quadrupled the square footage, value of what that real estate was, just based on the mechanics of what appraisals are supposed to do. So, let's just say the apartment building next door to Trump's tower, with a comparable property had, I don't know, let's call it 1,000 square feet, $1,000 per square feet sort of thing, which would be very high, right? But, Donald Trump would just quadruple it. Well, why would he quadruple it? Well, he quadruple it because that's how you can get loans. The asset that you have is collateral for the loan that you can get. Now, you guys might recall that Donald Trump has done business with Deutsche Bank for a very long time. Now, Deutsche Bank is a German bank. It's been around long before the Nazis, but certainly became part of the Nazi machine. But, I do know that, for example, in the history of Deutsche Bank, they were involved with doing pumping and dumping schemes with the railroads in the United States back in the 1900s with robber barons, for example. Okay? Finance is finance. Finance has been doing a lot of this kind of stuff for a very, very long time. Fast forward to, let's call it the 2000s, Deutsche Bank becomes a heavy hitter on Wall Street. Yeah, it's a German bank, but it's basically helmed and operated and managed by Wall Streeters. And, many of you might recall that if you saw the movie The Big Short, that the main character that was played by, oh gosh, what's his name? The guy who was in La La Land. He's fantastic. He's going to be in Barbie. I'd look it up, but everybody knows who he is. Anyway, he plays this account executive at Deutsche Bank, and he's, approaching, selling mortgage-backed securities to these hedge fund guys. And these hedge fund guys ultimately are represented by, eventually Christian Bale's character. And they all realize that because of this vector, this guy is telling them that all of the reps and warranties that are going into selling these mortgage bonds and these securities and these trusts and everything else are just bullshit. But hey, you can make a lot of money now because everybody's buying them. Because what was actually happening in the global marketplace was there was $70 trillion in global appetite for mortgage-backed securities. And that was coming because places like China and all over the world suddenly had capital to invest. And they were looking for safe haven. And safe haven just happened to be AAA, the gold standard American real estate market. And oh, by the way, since 2001, after the 9/11, that we basically hit the booster jets on the housing market because Alan Greenspan lowered interest rates to next to nothing, so that developers could borrow and build projects and sell into these securities that everybody around the world was buying. And so, who was packaging these deals? Banks, as well as investment banks. But going back to the Deutsche Bank analogy, they were also moving a lot of money, by the way, for Vladimir Putin. And what was Putin involved with? Well, Putin and the oligarchs have been extracting wealth from Russia for the last 20 years. And we're talking about real wealth. We're talking about, oil and minerals and timber. And I mean, Russia is a giant country with incredible natural resources. And so these oligarchs just became the Romanovs, okay? So there's a lot of communists out there that hate capitalism, and yet, they kind of be a little bit, I don't know, bewitched by, what's going on in the theater between Ukraine and Russia and everything that constitutes. But I think people get convoluted in their mind. Well, what is Russia? Well, Russia is a mafia state, and it kind of was that way for 400 years, of course, behind the monarchy of the Romanovs, right? Which is incredible when you consider everything that happened after the Russian Revolution through Stalin. Okay, but getting back to Deutsche Bank, and they were laundering money for Russia in a massive, massive way. So much so that they got fined, I think, eventually billions of dollars for doing so, and they had to, I think, stop doing it. But who knows? I mean, who's actually governing or regulating the situation? I mean, I have a ton of questions, but they were the Russians were laundering a lot of money out of Russia into real estate in London and the United States, but particularly New York. And so Donald Trump, as a developer, he's like, yeah, he said it on camera many times, right? Hey, Saudi Arabia, they're great clients. They're putting all their money in my real estate. Now, when you have all of this money coming in from overseas into your huge, towers that you're selling at high prices, but doesn't matter to people who have been stealing money from their country, I guess they're paying for it. I mean, look, whatever the market will bear, right? But at the same time, appraisal values can be manipulated, as we're seeing the investigation from the AG's office into Donald Trump, and for what is control fraud, which ultimately is hyper evaluating the assets to act as collateral for liquidity to build more projects. And then you take a fee and you screw everybody else. And that's what Donald Trump has done. That's called financialization. And that's what we do within the context of major real estate development, both in residential and commercial. And we've been doing it a long time. And it can be completely illegal, particularly when you find out, for example, Donald Trump was under investigation for all sorts of tax fraud. And just the very basics are like, okay, well, he's saying that he's at a loss. He's not making any money because the real estate is valued much less on his tax returns than it is on the loans, the application for the loans that he's making. And of course, Donald Trump, because he's a huge figure, he was handled by a special person at Deutsche Bank who only handled certain clients, and it could go on and on. Look, I'm not here to try to litigate Donald Trump specifically. I'm using him as a segue into making you aware and understand what it is that I've done as a producer, my team has done, to bring you the largest revelation of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that never ended. Now, if you can just kind of put in the back of your mind everything that I just laid out, right, which is just a very surface sort of surface look at kind of how this whole thing works. But yesterday, of course, again, the state of Michigan is bringing felony charges for documentation fabrication for the elector certification because Donald Trump was presumably, through this conspiracy, defrauding the United States, and saying that the whole election was a lie. Now, I'll remind you that in Donald Trump's it makes me laugh because he's such a perfect reflection and refraction of everything that's going on. But it's hard to believe this is possible, but it is. And of course, when you go back to the 80s and you think of Donald Trump's relationship with the with the National Enquirer at that time, we all knew that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, and a lot of these like rag magazines would plant all sorts of strange truths, that would be kind of hiding in plain sight, but yet be so absurd that nobody would believe them. And it was kind of an interesting sort of corollary to be able to manipulate and manage, sort of PR and that sort of thing. But and of course, Donald Trump was super involved with, I can't even think of the guy's name who was the CEO of the National Enquirer's Dick something or other. I mean, just like a name straight out of a cartoon. But, look, Donald Trump in the last month is under this investigation because of the Jack Smith investigation into the top secret, clearance documents that he took to Mar-a-Lago. And in the process, they started to charge Donald Trump's attorneys for what was known as the criminal fraud exception, which means that his attorneys can be, held accountable for lying for their client. Oh, wow. And you've heard Lawrence O'Donnell at MSNBC and Lawrence Tribe, the professor at Harvard, basically, oh my God, the gall, right? Because it's like that goes not just from the attorneys are lying for their client, but also in the case of Judge Eileen Cannon, who was obviously picked by the Trump administration, is getting the message that she's going to rule and push it out and try to make things easy for Trump to not get hammed down because he's running for president and all of those sorts of insanities. But the point being that mainstream media is questioning the integrity and impugning the integrity of the court, also connected to the fact that attorneys can lie in context to those revelations that, oh, you can't lie on certified documentations, otherwise it's a felony. And oh yeah, the whole thing that Don supposedly was doing was defrauding the United States based on deceptive acts and practices is really what it's going to come down to. And all of these things are being illuminated as being grifts that can be held legally accountable. So Donald Trump is playing roulette with the country by being able to, create this sort of, oh, woe is me, I'm a victim. The Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, who incidentally was, taught at Harvard by Professor Tribe, and small kind of world here. And then they're saying that the Biden administration is weaponizing, the Department of Justice to unfairly accuse Donald Trump, who's innocent of everything, while millions of people, especially led by these vectors out of Congress, who I think are paid just to do this. I mean, I think that's how they got in there to begin with, through dark money. But Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Jim Jordan, and of course we don't hear much from him, but this biggest ass clown of them all, who I think is like George Costanza, of course. God, what is his name? I've been trying to put his name will come to me in a minute. The guy out of Long Island, but Santos, George Santos. So anyway, they're all saying that Donald Trump is innocent, and oh yeah, look at Biden, because Biden's family, because of all of this nonsense and this kind of insanity with Hunter Biden and Burisma and some corruption, and yeah, that would be shocking, and I'm sure a lot of it's true. And oh yeah, don't forget that Biden had some documents and that he shouldn't have had, that were top secret, that wound up, and that was for a news cycle that was probably planted about 6 months ago. But the long and the short of it is, these guys are out saying, oh my God, look at these LLCs that Biden is hiding behind, and he's got the Department of Justice weaponized, and they're unjustly targeting Trump, because Trump is innocent and Trump is our savior, and Trump is saying, I've done all of these things and they're coming after me for you, as if he's Christ, right? Okay. it's so ridiculously over the top and so laughable. But at the same time, for anybody who's been around for the last few decades, have we not seen the prosperity gospel in these mega churches and these guys like, going back to the 80s, Tammy Faye Baker and Jim Baker and everything they got busted for at that time? But we have this sort of vertical patriarchy that works really well in sort of alignment and harmony with corporate America, which really has become this sort of fusion of corporate fascism, also Christo-fascism, and we're seeing it play out in MAGA, which I always say is corruption births and fuels fascism. And so Donald Trump is an example of this, while saying he's free, he's innocent of all of these charges. Meanwhile, he should have been thrown in prison long before he became the president of the United States. But mainstream media is like, oh my God, look at Donald Trump. My God, we got him, and you got guys in social media like Rob Reiner and others, particularly I think of John Cusack and, other vectors of celebrity sort of thing, like, oh my God, the Department of Justice is doing its job, and Merrick Garland's a hero, and, he's going to bring down the hammer of justice on, Trump. So look, we're a democracy. The integrity of law is intact. Everything's fine. Meanwhile, what we discovered in the con is that tens of millions of documentation fraud were created in a landscape pipeline of hell that created liar's loans and ninja loans that were all written without underwriting, where brokers would actually take different aspects of the information on applications for mortgages and change tax returns, change income, change assets, hyperinflate assets, do whatever they had to do because they knew how to get the loan approved, and they got the loan approved. And the way the game also played was all they really needed at this time period between 2004 and 2006. And this all manifested because of what we call deregulation, which took place during really starting with the Reagan administration, but going through the Clinton administration and then going on overdrive after 9/11, quite frankly. Deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization. And what these brokers were doing and underwriters were doing, they were getting paid to lie. They were getting paid to create what we call in the trade deceptive acts and practices that they were then moving through the pipeline because of what we call perverse incentives, all created by what we call control fraud, which were all emanating from the CEOs of our financial system and what we call the too big to fail banks, or otherwise what I'd like to call as the pharaohs. They're the pharaohs. If you go to any city in the United States, you'll see that the largest buildings, the highest skyscrapers, are the too big to fail banks. I noticed that in 2008. That's when it first started happening. It used to be like oil companies and big insurance companies and this or that. Now it's Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase. In New York, you'd find Goldman Sachs, blah, blah, blah. But by the way, Goldman Sachs never puts their name on their buildings, so nobody knows it's Goldman Sachs. But the control fraud apparatus, the way it works specifically, I'll give you an example with the CEO of the largest bank of the United States. His name is Jamie Dimon. Now, Jamie Dimon's been around the block. Jamie Dimon's come up in a very peculiar sort of set of circumstances, and most notably working with Sandy Weill for an outfit that became Citigroup. And Citigroup was very influential at getting rid of a lot of regulation during the 90s. But prior to that, they were in business together because they both had some hardships in Wall Street, and they they kind of got booted from Wall Street, and they wound up in Baltimore providing what we call predatory loans, which are liar's loans. And they made a lot of money. And there was a big hurricane that took place down in Texas at this time. I think it was Hurricane Allen that created billions and billions of dollars of damage that Travelers Insurance was in some desperate situations. So Sandy Weill decides to create a supermarket bank with Jamie Dimon as number two. Remind you that they started with predatory lending. So they decide to get Phil Gramm, who was a senator, what was he? Was he a lobbyist at this time? I'm not sure if he was in Congress or the Senate at this time. I think he was in the Senate. Senator Phil Gramm. What am I talking about? Yes, of course he was a senator. It's his wife who was a lobbyist for Enron, who all were baked into the same situation. But they create the supermarket bank where they ended up buying Travelers. So you have all of these different outfits that were broken up under the lessons learned during the Great Depression, called Glass-Steagall, and all of this stuff came from because there was massive, massive suffering during the Great Depression that preceded, of course, all things World War II. But there was a gentleman by the name of Ferdinand Pecora who was assigned as an investigator to find out what Wall Street was doing. And this guy wasn't an expert in finance, but as it turns out, he was an expert in the mob. He actually came out of Sicily. He was an immigrant, and he wasn't a big fan of all things the WASP empire at the time. So he pulled off some miracles, and he was a guy with integrity and courage, and he put together really, I think, what's the most monumental, miraculous investigation probably in the history of the world. And he got all of Wall Street's secrets out for the country that was in desperate straits because of Hoovervilles and like 25% unemployment, millions of people dying of starvation, that sort of thing. And they started to hear the news because all of the media covered it of how Wall Street grifted its way to destroying everybody else. And as such, we ended up having this upheaval where government literally became government of, by, and for the people. And that coincided with what was actually before the New Deal with FDR. But FDR was swept in on this because there was just so much misery. But at that time period, what this guy, Ferdinand Pecora, was able to achieve was ultimately he created Glass-Steagall, which separated. It was a bill that in a law that became where corporations and banks could not trade for their own account. You had to separate commercial lending from speculative lending, or all of the manifestations of banking, which we needed the safety and soundness of a financial system so that we wouldn't blow up. That was the idea. Just like a ship needs integrity to float, just like a plane needs integrity to fly. That's what they did with our financial system. And as a result of the heroic work by Ferdinand Pecora, we ended up with about 70 years of stability, minus a couple of crazy things that took place, most notably the savings and loan crisis in the late 80s, which basically taught Donald Trump everything he needed to know, which he was super involved with his casinos up in New Jersey. And who's involved typically with New Jersey? Well, I think we know from history, the mob, right? So I'm sure you had all sorts of scenarios involved with that, which as it turns out, there was a lot of mobsters involved with S&Ls, and they'd do these control fraud scenarios and half-baked schemes to basically lend money and bankrupt the situation. And that's why it's called bankruptcy for profit. And that's why Donald Trump basically has gone bankrupt 6 times before he became president. So he was also a master of all of this stuff, and he was never held accountable because we had deregulation. Why? Because the entire financial system was doing the same thing. Most notably in this analogy, Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank was one of the top vectors of this stuff, and they were, by the way, getting tons and tons and tons of liquidity from foreign investment that was extracting, that was going into our financial system, into mortgage-backed securities. So ultimately, what happens is you get this situation where there's this massive, massive grift, where there's tens of millions of liar's loans baked in the system based on deceptive acts and practices, which are illegal. And they wound up to the tune, for example, with one of the top whistleblowers that we profile in the con, a gentleman by the name of Richard Bowen, who was the top underwriter for Citibank, who discovered that they were buying liar's loans that were being built with these lying tactics through this process that I just demonstrated that Donald Trump has done in his own work, and he's about to be prosecuted on top of everything else, not to mention, as I mentioned at the outset, that we're all talking about today. Oh, by the way, it's illegal to lie on certifications. All right, what we're talking about is massive, massive deception and lies in massive legal documents called mortgages, and they became liar's loans. Okay, I mean, ridiculous liar's loans. I could talk for 10 hours about what kind of examples I have, but that's going to take us away from the mainstream point of what this analysis is all about. And ultimately, I had a Twitter Spaces the other day where we had this incredible defense attorney out of South Florida in Miami who just had his law license revoked because the entire Bar Association of Florida came after him for impugning the integrity of the court, for allowing tens of millions of documentation fraud to illegally foreclose on millions of people. So he has all the evidence, he has all the truth, he puts it in front of the judges, and the judges make him the criminal for telling the truth. As it turns out, the Supreme Court of Florida was handpicked by DeSantis' general counsel, who was a guy that came out of Rick Scott's outfit, who was around during the 2008 great financial crisis, who went through the revolving door, became the the general counsel of what's known as Lender Processing Services, which was the largest purveyor vector of documentation fraud as it relates to what we called MERS. You may have heard of Lorraine Brown and some of these other, all of these VPs were signing different, bullshit names on illegally foreclosing on people around the country. In fact, this company was, hiring high schoolers to act as VPs to, put forward lying documents on documents that were taking people's homes that they were set up and that all of their, hard work and their equity in these houses were being stolen. And then ultimately the media said, well, they got greedy and they wanted to refinance their house and they used their house as a bank. And that's another story. And it's part of it. And that's all in the con as well at www.thecon.tv. But ultimately, what you wind up, seeing is that everything that Donald Trump is reflecting, that the mainstream media and the front page of the New York Times and every single night on mainstream media is talking about, is a literal microcosm of what it is that we reveal to you. And if you, again, for credibility, right? Are you going to question Lawrence Tribe out of Harvard University? For those of you who are educated professionals that, look, there are adults in the room, right? And you would consider Lawrence Tribe one of them. Well, he's explaining to us that here's a criminal fraud exception in the case of Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, going into Mar-a-Lago, and that Trump's attorneys are lying. Can you buy that? Can you buy that Judge Eileen Cannon might have a conflict of interest and not be a fair umpire or an arbiter of justice in this situation because of corruption? Oh, yeah, by the way, what's been going on in the Supreme Court? Well, in the Supreme Court, we have Clarence Thomas and all things related to, Harlan Crow. And of course, the situation with Judge Alito and taking fancy trips and not reporting it. And they just think they're kings and they can rule on, fossil fuel and real estate interests, and get these gazillion-dollar, back-ended deals. And hey, no harm, no foul with ethics because it's not illegal because nobody questions the Supreme Court justice, even though the Supreme Court justice in the SCOTUS is arbiter of the ultimate truth. Meanwhile, about 2 years ago now, the Supreme Court heard a case on Goldman Sachs versus the Teachers Pensions Union of Arkansas, as well as the Plumbers and Steel Pipe Fitters of America, where all of those, working people had sued Goldman Sachs for illegal reps and warranties and deceptive acts and practices based on everything I'm telling you. And by the way, I've got loads of evidence on what took place, which was the real Big Short. I've got to segue here for a second to that. So if you ever watch The Big Short, you end up with the situation. What they were profiling was a world famous and legendary investor, a guy by the name of Michael Burry, who Christian Bale played in that film. He is the guy that's, playing the drums and waiting for the other shoe to drop because they supposedly did their due diligence. In the real life story, Michael Burry and his hedge fund, they made out like $498 million on shorting the housing market because they did their due diligence because of what they ended up learning from Deutsche Bank. Okay, well, the real story was, this is where it gets slightly confusing, but bear with me. Our former Secretary of the Treasury is a guy by the name of Hank Paulson. Hank Paulson, prior to becoming the Secretary of Treasury of the United States, was the CEO of Goldman Sachs. This was the exact thing that happened during the Clinton administration because they had a Secretary of Treasury who was the CEO of Goldman Sachs by the name of Robert Rubin. Okay, so you can see that we all know that, especially for those of you who think that Trump drains the swamp, because he put the same guys in power during his administration that the previous two administrations had put in power. But there's another Paulson by the name of John Paulson, who was actually a hedge fund trader who literally packaged the largest trade in history. And it was the real Big Short. And in comparison, the Big Short that John Paulson made, and it's the largest trade in history. He walked with $20 billion. Not a $500 million that they showed you in the Big Short, $20 billion. And by the way they were able to do that was they bought a company that we profile in the Con at www.thecon.tv called Greenpoint, where they did verticals. And by the way, yesterday, for anybody who knows this type of information, hey, guys, let's have a celebration. Angelo Mazzillo died. If you guys think it's hot in the Southwest with these screaming temperatures, let's hope that wherever Angelo Mazzillo is going is a lot hotter than what he was experiencing behind his Gilded Gates in Santa Barbara versus he should have been arrested 20 years ago or at least 15 years ago. But the long and the short of it is that John Paulson makes out with $20 billion because Goldman Sachs had purchased Greenpoint, and they were hand-picking the worst of the worst liars' loans to be put into these trusts that they then vectored around the world and through other money managers that worked at Goldman, laid on people like the Teachers Pension Union of Arkansas, as well as the pipe fitters and the unions, the steel unions of America, that, of course, the Supreme Court of the United States said it was like an act of God. And they didn't do any discovery, which, by the way, none of the judiciary in Florida allowed Bruce Jacobs in millions of scenarios to put together discovery of what it is that we show you in the Con. And I'll never forget, I was actually in a video conference where I watched firsthand a judge in one of these cases that Bruce Jacobs was fighting for his client that was an African American that was having her house stolen because she had paid all of her mortgage, but just because things are so whacked out with the servicers and the foreclosure mills that they could just steal people's homes, particularly people of color who can't defend themselves. And this guy, Bruce Jacobs, was defending them with all of the actual evidence of what it is that I'm telling you. And the judge says to him, look, Bruce, it all sounds very compelling, but if you were my government and you told me this, then I'd have to believe you. But they didn't, so I won't. Now, meanwhile, that's a ridiculous statement because the government has said everything that it is. And I'm telling you through 4 different vectors. First, they did the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission where they laid this whole thing out. Unfortunately, it didn't create 30,000 criminal referrals like Bill Black got from the savings and loan crisis that led to convictions of 1,000 executives in the early 90s. No, instead, they had 11 criminal referrals after 1,000 witnesses in interviews and so forth. That lasted over a year, that cost $11 million, that went nowhere because it's a bipartisan fucking con job that, basically destroyed all this information. But what it did was it did lead to all of these massive settlements that were civil settlements that then Attorney General Eric Holder had basically, decided to quash the investigation into criminal investigations that destroyed millions of people, of which it ultimately destroys the career of, the last remaining good attorney trying to protect people that can't protect themselves because the goddamn system is exactly what Lawrence Tribe is saying is happening in Florida. That you have attorneys lying to, be able to push these liar foreclosures through, and they have forever. And then ultimately the judges are allowing them to do it, even though they know it, nobody's stopping them. But in this case, because the powers that be, because, Donald the Con Trump, who's been up to his eyeballs in this whole thing for, 30, 40 years, they're like, okay, the guy's a threat. He's enough of a threat. We got to take him down. But do you think it's convenient that the whole, like last night I was watching Alex Wagner, right? And Alex Wagner says, oh my God, it's almost like jaw dropping. It's just incredible. The entire, legal apparatus of the United States is working in conjunction to take down this massive fraud to the United States of America, Donald Trump. He's one guy, and he's guilty. I can't wait to see him go down, but he's one guy. What we show you in the con, by the way, we spent $4.5 million to get you this information. Okay? $4.5 million to get you this information. That is not inexpensive. That took a ton of resources, time and effort and professionals and thousands of hours of investigation to get the full story that we could get to the public. And by the way, just so you know, because of Dominion and libel and everything else, if you think Dominion has a powerful, corporate legal staff, what do you think freaking Chase has as the largest bank in the United States? What about Wells Fargo? What about Bank of America? What about Goldman Sachs? Could they sue us if we showed exactly who did what, when, and how from their apparatuses that are the chieftains of this whole thing? Could they sue us into oblivion if we did anything wrong and this was libelous? Well, of course they would, and the con could never be out there. But because we crossed our T's and dotted our I's, and because we have the greatest criminologist in the history of the world, William K. Black, that was our mentor in this whole thing, and we have the testimony of the former director of investigations from the Department of Justice, a gentleman by the name of Paul Pelletier, who is a 30-year veteran of the DOJ and who worked in, for example, Miami to flush out, La Costa Nostra and drug dealings and all the other things. Yeah, he gives us all the inside scoop on what happened at DOJ. And then same with Chris Swecker, the former director of investigations for white-collar fraud for the freaking FBI. Third in control at the third in a hierarchy at the FBI tells us exactly what happened. In this massive dragnet that they did that basically had a crime that would go on to basically destroy 50 million Americans, that would lead to tens of trillions of dollars backdoored to the illegal racketeering financial apparatus that blew up the world because they could buy the courts and they could buy the judicial system, and the rest is the rest. Corruption burrs and fuels fascism. So media sat on this stuff, and that's why I had to make the con. So the idea, or the title of this whole thing is Corruption in the Media of Deception is It's Destroying Us, and what can we do? Well, look, the first thing you could do is we made the con for free at www.thecon.tv for free. Some of you didn't experience the housing collapse. Some of you think it's like eons ago. First, it's not eons ago. It never ended. But the bottom line is it is our system. And it's the system that our media and everybody in government and everybody at the judiciaries can't let you know. So if you understand what the con is, it's a blueprint for redemption. Because the United States is supposed to be of, by, and for the people, which, of course, as I've illustrated through however long I've been talking, let's take a quick look here because I'm going to end this soon. About an hour. That's what I want to talk about, so I'll close it up. Um, no, we're not of, by, and for the people, and the integrity of law isn't supreme, even if Merrick Garland and Jack Smith get their guy, which it is literally child's play, considering all of the evidence. And I've watched evidence for Donald Trump indicting himself now for what, the last 2 years? I mean, it's just ridiculous that the guy's breathing free air. But the bottom line is the way media is setting it up. It's like, oh my God, we're going to be redeemed because we took down Trump because of the insurrection and everything else. Meanwhile, I've got a theory that Donald Trump decided to do everything that he did with, ironically, everybody's favorite vampire milk job, alcoholic, married 3 times, everybody's favorite mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, who was somebody, way back different, because he was the guy that was in the midst of all of the racketeering success with the 5 families in Manhattan in the 70s, which I'm sure put him in proximity to Donald Trump at the time, right? So they go way back. And by the way, I did talk to Donald Trump, not Donald Trump. I talked to Rudolph Giuliani when I was making the con and I wanted to interview him, and he said, "How much money do you got?" And I was like, because he knew my partner had a shit ton of money. He was like, he was trying to shake me down, and I was like, "Yeah, it's a documentary. We don't pay for interviews." Look, guys, it's all corrupt. Thanks for joining.